and supplier of heroin worldwide too. So they have two bases of operations.
Yeah, well, there are more because there are others as well. But basically what happened was that after 1949, the Soviets watched the Chinese, because Mao Zedong used drugs against his own people. Mm-hmm. And then after the revolution, the Chinese communists exported their drug trafficking as an element of their own operations. Mm-hmm. And the Soviets watched this, and then they set up their own separate international drug offensive. Mm-hmm. And in the course of doing this, they tried to penetrate those rings, those groups of drug operators that they could. And where they couldn't succeed to actually break in, they formed their own and replaced them, basically. Mm-hmm. And in Colombia, of course, through the America's Department of the Cuban Communist Party, they control what's going on in Colombia. Mm-hmm. No question.
So this organized criminalism as an activity on the part of the KGB since 1961 is the Russian mafia and controls any business activity that we hear about as examples of alleged free enterprise breaking out in the so-called New Russia and the satellite nations.
That's almost entirely true. I mean, what we have in these countries is what Lenin called state capitalism, which I now have renamed state-controlled capitalism.
Yes.
Which means that it appears to the West as though these enterprises are entirely freestanding, right. And they've got shareholders, and they have managing directors, and they've even got in Moscow large office blocks like Gazprom, mm-hmm. But they are in fact entirely controlled by the state,
right.
With the revolution, but through the intelligence services.
Yeah, and that's a deception and a performance very similar to the performance of political democratism, where we see alleged rival parties and rival candidates taking part in elections in the so-called New Russia and the new satellite nations, when actually all of these parties are controlled by KGB personnel, and it is a performance for the American public to watch on CNN and through other parts of the media. A major part of this strategy since 1961 has consisted of building slowly and installing a very dictatorial regional world government over all of Europe on top of the existing socialist bureaucracies that are in the governments of each of these countries, over all of Europe, and now sadly also Britain, in the form of the European Union. And this constitutes an accomplishment of Leninist strategy, as predicted by Golitsyn. And of course, while the KGB had infiltrated all the European governments and the British government, as they had infiltrated the American CIA and other parts of the United States government, in addition to that, the current treaty arrangements between the European Union, based in Brussels, and the New Russia, mean that there's even further, tighter Soviet and KGB control over the foreign policy of this new globalist regional government that controls Russia, that controls Europe, and controls Britain.
I don't disagree with any of that. One of the important things that Golitsyn teaches us in the Perestroika deception is that it doesn't matter who wins an election, the communists always win. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason for that is that every single political activist you see on the Moscow stage, if you can be bothered to see what's going on, because, by the way, the TV cameras are only focused on Moscow.
That's right.
You never see what's going on in Leningrad or in Tbilisi or in Alma-Ata or anywhere else, only Moscow. That's where the controls take place, because all the other so-called, free republics now, they're controlled, of course. These republics, they're still Stalinist states, almost entirely. There's hardly any, I don't think there are any exceptions to that. But this business of controlling all the political parties and allowing them to adopt different names, this was a conscious policy which was laid down by Gorbachev and Yeltsin at the 28th Party Congress in July 1990. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin made speeches in which they said to the comrades, now is the time to follow whatever path you feel would be most appropriate. In a nutshell, that's what they said. We have the two quotes in my book, the European Union Collective. So that's what I call democratism, which is the creation and maintenance of the illusion of democracy. Now that pattern is being implemented in the European Union because by various means, almost all the participants, even at national level, in the political process, are selected for the job, or are, appointed, or are chosen. Now, it's quite difficult to explain this, but in Britain there's an extremely lethal piece of legislation which requires all political parties to register at a central registration point. And it basically dictates what the political parties can and cannot do. But in the European, at the European level, no political party can participate in the European Parliament if it's not 100% signed up to the idea of the European project.
And submission to the authority of this regional world government based in Brussels, which is now imposing dictatorial controls on a daily basis down to the most minute level of business and human activity on all residents of Europe and increasingly in Britain. And if you read the Financial Times newspaper, you see examples daily and in the Wall Street Journal of how the European Union is trying to tell people and businesses in the United States what they will do.
That's quite true. When Gorbachev visited London briefly for a day on the 23rd of March 2000, and during that visit he made a statement which I repeated at every opportunity. He acknowledged and stated that the European Union is the new European Soviet, and I quote. Yes. That's what it is. Yes. Now, let me describe the European Union, what it really is. It is a political collective. So all these British politicians who constantly talk about the need to be in the centre of Europe and the need to influence, for Britain's great experience to be used for the benefit of the Europeans so that they, so that we can influence what they do, are completely wasting their breath. They are insulting our intelligence. This is a political collective. In a political collective, decisions are taken collectively. Right. No individual nation can take any decisions. Now,
it destroys the sovereignty completely of all the individual nations.
We have no sovereignty. Right. We have no interests, and we have politicians in Westminster who talk about British interests. We have delegated and collectivized those interests. Now, there are a few residual peculiar exceptions. For example, there's a thing called the Common Foreign and Security Policy, which is part of the collectivization process. Well, Britain flouted that policy by joining the United States in respect of this Iraqi operation. Right. But we shouldn't have done that. The Europeans didn't know what to do and threw up their hands in horror. Yes. But this will probably be the last chance we'll have if we don't get out of it.
So Gorbachev's purpose, and it's so interesting that Golitsyn describes Gorbachev in the book he wrote in 1980 before anyone had heard of him, describes his role, describes the character that he would play on the stage of this deception, describes him, and his purpose obviously was to go from the third-party program of 1961 to about 1985, and in 1985 start the idea that the Stalinist model was over with and that there was going to be this new reform system. Yeah. Christopher, I knew we could just barely get into the subject matter thus far, but we're going to do another show on related topics, recent topics. I want to thank you so much for being with me today, and if you're interested in learning more about what we've discussed and being able to examine the background information so you can learn about this massive and successful Soviet disinformation strategy, please contact us at the phone number or address given at the end of the program, and we'll get you that information. This is Bill McElhaney for the McElhaney Report, thanking you for being with us today.